Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexis Capiatis, Partnership and Business Development Manager at the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. On behalf of CHTA, I'd like to welcome you all to the CHTA webinar, Learn How You Can Develop Tourism Clusters Within Your Country Through a Grant Project. As a reminder, CHTA webinars are a member benefit. If you have not updated your profile or paid your 2019-2020 dues, please do so after the webinar. Also, we hope to see you all in the Bahamas for our upcoming 2020 Caribbean Travel Marketplace taking place January 21st to the 23rd. Registration is currently open. Before we proceed with the webinar, let's go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be distributed to our CHTA members. Outside of the main presenters, all participants have been muted to avoid disruption from latecomers and to minimize distractions. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, please send them via the chat box and they'll be answered in the order they were received during the Q&A section. The webinar will last approximately 45 minutes. Now I'd like to introduce CHTA CEO Frank Comito for a few words.
Thank you, Alexis, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to, on behalf of CHTA, I'd like to thank the IDB Complete Caribbean for working with us to showcase this opportunity for destinations and member hotels and tourism-related enterprises in those destinations. The IDB is certainly familiar to many of us. Several of our NHTAs, National Hotel and Tourism Associations, including Grenada, Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, have worked with the IDB in the past on both cluster development projects, marketing development projects, and certainly many more of us have worked with them on energy efficiency projects as well. So we're no stranger to the organization. They're presenting some developmental opportunity for associations and tourism-related enterprises. We want to thank them. Let's get right into it, Alexis.
Yes, so thank you, Frank. Now I'd like to welcome Annie Bertrand, Technical Coordinator with Compete Caribbean, who will be leading this webinar. Thank you so much, Annie. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you. So I'm very excited to present to you this funding opportunity that is available. Unfortunately, my colleague Courtney was not able to join us to present with his nice Jamaican accent, so you'll have to suffer my French-Canadian accent. So if you feel that sometimes I get too excited and I speak too fast, you can raise your hands in the chat and Alexis can interrupt me at any time. So I just want to briefly talk about Compete Caribbean. What is this program, in case that some of you are not fully aware, and how it is executed briefly. And then we'll talk about the community-based tourism toolkit, which is something that we have developed in order to help build stronger projects. So the Compete Caribbean program is essentially a private sector development program, and it's a consortium of donors. So it's the IDB, the government of UK, the Caribbean Development Bank, as well as the government of Canada. So the idea was to join forces in order to address the problem of lack of economic growth in the region. So the first phase of Compete Caribbean was a huge success. It created the 12,000 jobs, increased revenues and export of the firms involved by quite a substantial amount. So given the success of the first phase, a second phase was established in 2017 for another 5 years. And the objectives are the same. We are always about creating jobs and revenues and exports, but there's a little bit more focus on women-owned firms and climate change. So how do we execute the Compete Caribbean program? So it's essentially two pillars. One focused on productivity and innovation in the private sector, and the other one is focused on business climate reforms. So there are several instruments that we use to stimulate productivity, innovation, and competitiveness of our sector, or not just tourism, but also other sectors as well. But today, I just want to focus on what is most relevant to you, which is the call for cluster proposals, which fits into the first instrument. But if we have the time at the end, there are other instruments that are also relevant for the tourism sector, including corporate venturing, technology extension services, and the blockchain innovation initiative that we have also launched last month. So if we have time at the end, I can also share with you those opportunities. So the call for cluster proposals. So we launched last month this call for cluster proposals focused on tourism and agrotourism. It is the first time that we actually launch a call that is sector specific, and So and it's the last call for the last opportunity for funding for clusters. So I think most of you know a cluster is a group of interconnected firms operating near each other that collaborate but also compete to obtain a larger share of the global market. And here on the slide, you can see the type of examples, some examples of technical assistance that can be funded through our grant funding. Well, in the case of, for example, on tourism, it's also interesting, specifically if you are interested in supporting community-based tourism. We found in our study tours that oftentimes the small and medium, the micro and small businesses in the remote areas oftentimes struggle with getting their entrance, their licensing, and registering their businesses at a formal sector. There's also huge gap in digital transformation of the Caribbean sector, tourism sector, which is really far behind. So these are great opportunities to make a big difference and leap forward. So the cluster selection process, the way it works and the timeline. So initially, the first step is that you as the tourism association is well positioned to identify members in your country that may be interested in expanding their reach, increasing the spending of your visitors when they come to the country. So the goal is to identify them and help them prepare a concept note. And the concept note is essentially like one page or a 2-page it's 1-page information with some data that needs to be submitted. And because it's private sector focused, oftentimes we are aware that the private sector doesn't have the time to write a full proposal that can be submitted to a program like ours to get funded. So the next step is that we would provide a professional consultant, which we call a cluster facilitator, to work with the private sector stakeholders that you have been identified in the concept note, and we will help them to write the full proposal. So oftentimes, for example, you may have a resort or a large hotel or several hotels that come together maybe to develop a new area in the country where you have natural attractions that are there, but a lot of work has to be done to set up and coordinate the community members and all this. So in order to facilitate the full establishment of priorities and objectives and implementation plan and budget and getting the participatory approach done, it's oftentimes too time consuming for the private sector stakeholders. So we provide a consultant who is expert in this, a facilitator, who will for a 3-month period or 4 months work with the stakeholders to prepare the entire cluster development plan, which is essentially a strategic plan with an implementation plan, but also include a partnership agreement so that everybody is clear on what everybody is contributing to the whole project, everybody is clear on the vision, everybody is committed to it, so that it has more stakeholders focused on achieving success. And the next step after that is the investment panel. So all those cluster development plans are submitted to an independent panel, which is composed of experts in the sector, which will be evaluating each cluster project. And then there's the selection process. And then we move into the contracting process and the implementation, which oftentimes lasts for 2 months, 2 years or more. So eligibility criteria, very simple. We need 3 collaborating entities. So for example, if your association is one entity, that's fine, but the 2 other entities must be from the private sector. So it is very important that the projects are market driven and private sector led. So if you see a great opportunity, you have to make sure that you have the private sector that are interested in it. So either a hotel, resorts, or it can be the tour operators, or it can be travel agencies, but they have to be private sector firms interested in the project. The other criteria is obviously being member of our 13 beneficiary countries, which is not something we have control over. And then finally, which is a big important point to mention, is the commitment for counterpart contribution of 20% of the total budget. The counterpart contribution can be provided in different ways. So for example, the $400,000 is the maximum amount that can be provided by Complete Caribbean. So the grant funding that we provide cannot represent more than 80% of the total budget. So therefore, if you are going for the total amount for us, then it would mean that you are able to gather $50,000 in contribution in cash and contribution in kind. The contribution in kind is never a challenge because in all cases, the cluster stakeholders have to spend a lot of time in implementing the project. So it's rarely a challenge. But the challenge is really to identify stakeholders that are willing to invest cash into the project. Now, this is very important to mention. This is not about asking your private firms to put in a side amount of money into a bucket or into a bank account or set aside some money for the cluster projects to be implemented. It's not that. It's really to make sure that if the cluster project, for example, let's say you are going to a new community that requires all the stakeholders to be upgrading the infrastructure. Complete Caribbean cannot, it's a technical assistance program, and what that means is that we cannot fund any infrastructure improvement or any equipment. And in all cases, when we are invest such a huge amount of money into a project, they are infrastructure upgrades that are required, and they are equipments that needs to be purchased. So who is going to buy those equipment and who's going to fund this infrastructure upgrades? Well, in most cases, is the owners of those businesses that needs to be upgraded that will contribute their money. So if you have an hotel that is willing to, say, acquire a new bus to go to bring the visitors to a new community, for example, they'll keep the ownership of their bus. It's not that we are asking that this has to be donated to the project, but it's just that it's important that there are other stakeholders in the project that have skin in the game. So if the cluster define a strategy, and the strategy involves any purchase of equipment, then you will identify, the facilitator will work with the stakeholders to identify who is willing to invest whatever resources that is required to make this project successful, because it's about growth essentially. So oftentimes when you want to grow a market, then it requires some sort of investment. And I can provide, there are always exceptions, so we can talk about exceptions later if you have any questions. And the evaluation criteria are very simple, straightforward. It's about, again, job creation, revenue generation, increase in foreign exchange, and also the idea of catalytic and sustainable impact, which is include different criteria, but it's obviously subjective, but in each country would be different. The application process is the page, on our website, you can find the project concept note. It's a template that you need to fill. And then there are also data that we are requesting. So the tourism asset inventory, which is essentially to assess the potential given the assets that are already available in a particular community, and also a diagnostic or an assessment of the situation. So to better understand what is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats available, and understand the market readiness, so that we understand where, if the community also is understanding the requirements for moving forward. And then finally, the letter of commitment for the counterpart contribution. And all these documents need to be uploaded. And here you have a sort of an overview of the concept note that needs to be submitted. So the project information is based on data that you collect in the community. So although we're not asking like a 15-page proposal at this stage, it's just really an idea of what you're planning to do. It does still require some data collection process on the ground. So now I'll move to the community-based tourism toolkit, which again was designed to help develop stronger and better and more catalytic impact projects. There are 5 tools, but before I step into this, I just want to clarify one thing about the community-based tourism. So the community-based tourism definition, Caribbean Tourism Organization has been working quite extensively on defining what CBT is about. But CBT is very broad, right? It's not necessarily about, you know, going to have dinner inside the house of a community members. Yes, that's a good example. But community-based tourism is really about ensuring that the people that are offering the products and services are benefiting from it, and there is some sort of interactions with the visitors. So, you know, most of the businesses that you represent already offer some sort of community-based tourism. Maybe the only exception could be the main hotels or the main resorts that are not bringing their visitors outside. But that may be the only examples of where we actually do not involve the community members at all. So as I said, why we developed this toolkit is to build a pipeline of cluster projects that we can fund. So interestingly, as I said before, we had launched in total so far 4 calls for cluster proposals. The first one was in 2017 when we started the program. And we received, I think it was 91 applications, cluster proposals or project concept note. And only 19% of these applications came from the tourism sector, which was a big shock to us because in the first phase of Complete Caribbean, the most successful projects came from the tourism sector. So we realized that there is a lot more that we need to do in order to mobilize the stakeholders in the tourism sector. And then the other reason is to build the capacity of the business support organizations. You know that cluster development or cluster initiatives, I should say, is actually one of the most powerful tools for economic development in a country, but it's also one of the most difficult, right? So if you succeed, it has a deep impact in the long run. But CBT, community-based tourism, actually represents one of the most successful examples of cluster initiatives because it involves large firms, small firms, international firms, local firms, national firms. So it's a combination also of government, public, private, and nonprofits. So I think there's a lot that we can do in that space. And then finally, the Ministry of Tourism in most Caribbean countries, I'm sure that you are already aware, have appointed a person in their country to be responsible for developing community-based tourism. So we did that also to build their capacity. So this is the toolkit which we launched in St. Vincent and the Grenadines last August when we had when CTO organized the Sustainable Tourism Conference. And the toolkit includes 5 tools. Each tool is trying to achieve a particular purpose. So we'll go to each one briefly, and then we'll open up for question and answer so I can focus on the areas that you're most interested in. So the first one is about community tourism development. So we essentially prepared a template with experts that captured all the tourism asset in a particular community. Even you as a national tourism organization, you may have different communities that you may want to support, but how do you choose among them? Because there are different options, but it's unclear to you what exactly is out there. So the asset inventory is just a spreadsheet that provides some examples of assets that have been typically used in the past for driving community-based tourism. And I highlighted in green the experts because in a community, when you have experts, you are well advanced already. So just to give you an example of what the spreadsheet looks like, you have, as I said, 6 different types of assets and 19 subtypes. So for example, for the local experts here, you would have different experts in tourism, in natural cultural heritage, performing arts, visual arts. So then it gives you some examples. So if you ask a community leader or some or young people to go and start collecting data, they have a sort of a frame of reference to help them figure out what they need to capture. So if you go look at the bottom also, say for attractions, you have like menus that you can choose from to capture all this information and also provide some comments about the state of all those attractions, if they need improvement, there are issues around safety and security, that sort of thing. So it's just a spreadsheet. The other tool that we also created was a dynastic tool, because oftentimes in a community level, there are different stakeholders with different interests and different opinions about what should be the priorities. So this provides you, it's another spreadsheet, but it's a questionnaire that allows you to facilitate discussions at the community level with different stakeholders to look at, okay, we have to figure out where are we in terms of infrastructure, where are we about governance and leadership on the ground. Do these people have access to resources? Is the community involved? So it's a bunch of questions according to the different key success factors in community-based tourism. This was designed looking at best practices all over the world, but mainly in the north of Canada, but also in the Caribbean itself. We had done study tours and we have used community-based tourism experts that have been working in the Caribbean for years. And this is what it looks like. So you see for each of the dimensions, you have different categories, and then you have a bunch of questions that you can just sit down with them and discuss, and then together agree on if it's green, yellow, or red, just to facilitate discussions. So the goal is really not to be precise, but is to facilitate discussion and agree on priorities. Now, second purpose is enterprise development. So, okay, we may know which community we want to focus on, we may know the priorities, but then the entrepreneurs themselves need to improve their own operations. They need to register, they need to learn how to become more formal, they need to manage their cash flows and so on. So we created an enterprise handbook, which is essentially a book, but it's supposed to be user-friendly so that the people on the ground that may not necessarily have a university degree or even a high school degree, as long as they can read and write and count, they'll be able to follow this toolkit, this handbook, and better understand how to manage their business operations. And it really focused on all the examples, and everything around it is focused on community-based tourism, so that they understand the visitors' expectations, they understand how that industry works. It's also very interesting. Well, I'm not going to go in detail, but oh yeah, maybe one last thing. We also created 13 directories of business support services. So for each country, each of our 13 beneficiary country, there's a directory of business support services. So if you go into a community and you want to help the entrepreneurs, you give them this book, and then they will know where to go if they need to get a license, a food handling certificate, insurance registration, where to go to, everything is included into this handbook. And this handbook is also following the market readiness approach, which was designed by some experts to really speak. If you look at the category of export ready, when you read this as experts, you will understand that this is what we need the values that we start to inculcate at the community level. Next is about product development. Okay, so this is, I think, the most interesting tool that we have done for you, especially in tourism. It's a consumer research, and it's not just relevant for community-based tourism, but it's relevant for anybody operating in the tourism sector. So it's a thorough market research that we funded by Euromonitor in the American market to understand the willingness to pay for experiences or products and services that can be offered by Caribbean micro, small, medium enterprises. So what is it that visitors are interested to spend their money on? How much are they willing to pay? And then how can Caribbean businesses take advantage of this? So this market research was a very comprehensive process of identifying what are the products and services that are most relevant for us in the Caribbean. So we look at 30 different niche markets. I can give you the scorecards if you're interested. And then we prioritize based on the revenue, the interest level of visitors, and also the benefits to the Caribbean businesses, depending if there are already many businesses offering it, the price rate, and so on. And at the end of this prioritization, there were 15 products and services that were prioritized, and you can see here they are spread across a spectrum of different categories. And if you go to each of them, you can zoom in and identify different information about the willingness to pay. Now, what is most interesting for you all here is that the top quadrant to prioritize is about food. So it's very interesting to say that, even though we kind of identified, we tried to assess willingness to pay for all kinds of products and services, people are mostly interested in paying for food. They want to hear anything about food. They want to know where it comes from. They want to know that it's locally sourced. So if you go into that market research, you will see for each type of products analyzed, the 15 prioritized, look at the first one, traditional cuisine. So people are willing to pay up to $100 for a meal that is traditional cuisine. So very simple food that we eat every night in our house in the Caribbean. But the current price that visitors are paying for a Caribbean meal is $10. So there's a huge market potential that is being lost right now of $90 per person. But then if you go dig down into the analysis, you will see what is it that you need to do in order to capture that market, that revenues that we're not taking. Another one is the food and beverage tour. Getting the customers out of the hotel, get them to visit a local factory and offer them a meal after that. They were willing to pay $200 for it. But oftentimes they wanted to make sure that, transport is included, and there are all kinds of characteristics that they want to see available. So, at the bottom, it's not, I don't necessarily want you to go through this through the details right now, but just to give you that for each product listed here, You have 5 or 6 slides describing the characteristic of the products, and for each characteristic, the willingness to pay, as well as some characteristic about the consumers that is most willing to spend on that particular product, the profile of that consumers, how is this consumers finding this product, how is it booking for this service, and so on and so forth. So that market research, I think, is really a powerful tool to help generate more revenues. Obviously, at the end of the day, there are deal breakers that have been identified, and I think this is not a surprise to you all. It's about the perception about safety and hygiene. The consumers are willing to spend a lot of money for food, and they're willing to spend a lot of money to go outside of the resort, but they are mostly scared about the safety and hygiene. A lot of visitors don't know that the water in the Caribbean, for example, is safe to drink, so they'll go in the community and they will be super scared of eating anything because they worried about getting sick. So there are a lot of education that we need to do and awareness building, not only to the visitors directly, but also to the community-based tourism enterprises to make sure that they are informing the consumers or the visitors that about the safety of the food in the region. And then there are also other activities or actions that can be taken to prevent the consumers from spending, to ensure that they spend essentially. And also to keep in mind that the visitors are interested in knowing that the food is grown without chemicals. And also when you dig down into the study, it's interesting to see that, yes, organic certification always get a price premium, but not such a huge one. If at least you pay attention in making sure that they don't think their kale or their salad is soaked with pesticides and it's just done in a farm nearby, it's as powerful for them to be willing to pay extra money. And they also want to know that the communities are benefiting from it. They're willing to pay more if they know that the money that they're spending is not just going to the hotel owners. So finally, the most interesting statistic that captured is like only 21% of visitors, American visitors that are coming to the Caribbean, are familiar about community-based tourism. But 79% of them said they're willing to try once they become aware. So this is like represent a huge market opportunity for the region that we should try to tap into. But obviously, there's a lot of work to be done. And then finally, for market development, here, like it's just a sample template to capture the community-based the destination. So like a tool to capture in a standard manner at each community level, what types of products and services do we have, what type of attractions. So it's really for marketing purposes, because the idea is that in each country, the Ministry of Tourism could collect this information centrally, and then eventually we could have a database of community-based tourism destination in the region, so that visitors around the world, when we're competing with other regions like Africa and Asia, that there's a way to show that there are different, a wide variety of activities here. Okay, so finally, almost done, just like one last slide. The next steps is to get the community and youth involved in connecting the data, because even for your own sake, and we said the same thing with the Ministry of Tourism, because we had them for 2 days in St. Vincent to train them on this toolkit. But it's really, there are too many options on the ground, so we have to focus on the ones that has the highest potential of success initially. And then how do we identify the ones that have the highest potential to success? Well, it's to have some tools to capture what is out there. So you need to collect data on the ground and get the communities involved and getting this information. The market research is available to you. There's a PowerPoint presentation along with sort of a guide. They call it the training manual, but it explains each slide in detail. So that you need to review to identify market opportunities, identify local partners, and then produce the concept note. And finally, it's just about the fintech and blockchain innovation. Briefly, these are two. I mean, Complete Caribbean has done tons of market research, tons of research in general, but these are two research related to fintech. And what was astonishing for us was that about half of Caribbean MSMEs are underbanked or not banked at all. So it is very difficult for the Caribbean MSMEs to have access to the visitors, because visitors, as you all know, they travel with credit card. They don't like to carry cash around because it's not safe for them, and also because they're used to use credit card in their home countries. So if we find a way to digitalize the Caribbean firms, then we will be able to generate more revenues from the visitors, because they oftentimes even budget something initially, then they come here and they experiment different activities, then their willingness to pay increases on the ground, and they would be willing to pay more. But if you're not taking the cash, if they don't have the cash with them, then we're losing on opportunities. So this is an area of interest of mine, and if you are also interested in this area, we are trying to push the envelope as much as we can. The other research was from the London School of Economics students. They just essentially identified the impact of this friction for lack of access to finance. How does that affect the growth of the Caribbean sector, the tourism sector in the Caribbean? And they have estimated that if we're kind of trying to address these barriers, we can increase, it would represent an increase in tourism and arrival of 12%. Okay, so I will stop there. I think if Alexis, you can facilitate the question and answer, we can stop there. And if we have time at the end, I can also talk about the other funding opportunities related to the other projects I mentioned. But I think for now, I'd like to see if there are burning questions.
Thank you, Annie. Appreciate all that important information. Yes, everyone, it is time for the Q&A portion. Per usual, it is via the chat box. If you have any questions, they'll be answered in the order received. However, Annie requested that I enable participants to unmute themselves, so feel free to unmute yourself at any time and ask Annie a question. However, we are going to start with Mr. Frank Comito.
Hi, Annie, thank you for the information. It was helpful in better understanding what the project's about and the criteria. Two-part question. One is there a criteria for the size of businesses, of tourism-related businesses that can participate? Do they have to be SME types of tourism-related businesses? For example, if it's a hotel, does it have to be less than 100 rooms? I mean, are there criteria guidelines for us that way? And then if you address that, I'll ask my second question.
Okay, no, absolutely not. On the contrary, I think that the highest chance of success is when we have large firms or large businesses like hotels that are already strong, and they have the skill set required to embark into this type of projects, that are willing to invest efforts and energy in developing new products, but they don't want to invest that much. So for example, you have a large hotel or a large resort, even an all-inclusive, right? They may be interested in all-inclusive resorts. Actually, I know that Sandals, for example, in Jamaica is now interested in sending their visitors outside of their doors, because they know that is the only way of getting more revenues from them. And so you have hotels and resorts that are willing to go and explore communities that would be interested in offering new products and services, but they don't know necessarily how to go about this. They know that they need to have a participatory approach. They don't know how to go about this. So this is a perfect opportunity. So I would say, on the contrary, we are trying to target large businesses that are interested in going into that direction, and we will help them to mobilize the communities. We'll help them to mobilize the MSMEs on the ground. But we need the large firms for sure to be part of it, because otherwise it's just going to be a social program that will lead to minimal increment. We want to focus on revenues increase.
Okay, so a hotel and tourism association could engage with several of their members, their large, small, medium, or large-sized members on a cluster project. That works. Good. So the other part of my question is the vacation home rental industry really has spurred a lot of interest in community-based types of tourism activities, and but what we found through our National Hotel and Tourism Association is that for the most part, the owners are not engaged in the formal organizations like National Hotel and Tourism Associations, and as a consequence, they don't really derive the benefits and the capacity building types of things that some of our associations offer. So would a capacity building project which engages them, builds their skills more effectively, and their capacity to be more effective at extending community-based tourism activities into those enterprises, but doing it in a formalized way through a structure within that could be built within a National Hotel and Tourism Association for their membership. Would that conceptually be something that could work? Because a couple of our National Hotel and Tourism Associations might be interested in exploring something like that.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I would just say that the initial the challenge might be to convince them to join the project, because I suspect that in many cases these informal businesses are not necessarily reporting their revenues, and they may be scared of joining something formal, right? So it would be up to each country to decide how they want to approach it. But if they see the benefit, if they see that now by taking part of this cluster project, they'll be able to not only receive training, but also they double their number of visitors or X, Y, and Z. Will be up to each project to convince them to join the program, and see that ultimately by formalizing themselves and by learning how to improve, they'll be a winner at the end.
Okay, because often their skill sets are limited, but through an engaged way of working with the National Hotel and Tourism Associations around a project that provides capacity building and technical assistance, they could be improved.
Yeah, but I can just give an example on that note in particular. In Treasure Beach in Jamaica, there was the boutique hotels joined forces and got a cluster project together precisely to achieve this objective for community-based tourism. And you had this woman, she was good at cooking, and she was entertaining at the same time, and she was doing that on the street with a little, kind of like a food type of thing. And then I went to visit her this year, and she went from a little place that is really rustic to now a proper restaurant a few years later. I mean, I need to capture these stories, these success stories, but she finally, the cluster project helped her to become more formalized, bring new customers, and now she runs her own restaurant. And the same thing for there was a fisher folk who stopped fishing, and now he started to take visitors on a boat tour around the region, and explaining. He got some training on how to explain to the visitors stories, training on storytelling and sort of things. And that meant now I also saw him this summer, that when I went to visit the place, and you couldn't tell that he was like a fisher folk with no education before. It's impressive that the transformation that has happened in Treasure Beach in a span of like 5, 7, or maybe 10 years, given the effort that has been put into training the community-based entrepreneurs.
Oh, okay, well, thank you, Annie. Appreciate that. I see, Casey, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question you'd like to chime in?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot. I just want to know, on the criteria, do all three entities need to be Caribbean-based, or just have the benefit has to be Caribbean-based, has to be to the Caribbean islands? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's a good question to clarify, because you're right. I mean, for example, if you have a tour operator or a travel agency that is abroad that wants to be part of this, that's great, because that's what we want. We want to see, more revenues, as long as the funding would be spent on product development and Caribbean, beneficiaries. That's all.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey and Annie. Annie, I'd like to ask a question myself. Could you give us some examples of great cluster projects that were funded before, or that could be potentially funded?
Yeah, so I just gave an example of the Treasure Beach project, which was really focused on capacity building of the community-based tourism enterprises. And also in Treasure Beach, we also funded the establishment of a destination management organization, because at the end of it, there were so many opportunities, but they're very difficult. It was very difficult for the local community-based tourism and the local hotels to coordinate visitors. So we have funded the establishment of a destination management organization, which is up and running still today. But also another example is Adventure and Indigenous Tourism in Guyana, which was very interesting, because oftentimes when you tell community members that they should protect the environment around them, you know, they say whatever, whatever, whatever. But then if they start, if you tell them, well, if you protect your natural or animals, then you will be able to generate revenues out of it for many generations to come. And if they start to generate revenues out of it, they are much more interested in policing themselves and making sure that they protect their areas. And this is precisely what happened in the Rupununi area in Guyana. I mean, most people were their livelihood was based on fishing the fishes, and a lot of these fishes started to disappear. And the arapaima, for example, which is the largest freshwater fish in the world, was almost completely extinct. And then with this cluster project and the capacity building effort of the indigenous community, we were able to help them establish a law. And also, it's not really the law, because who's going to enforce it in the middle of nowhere in the south, you know, of the country? But it's now the community members that are able to make sure that there is everything is controlled and there's not overfishing. The animals are protected and their natural habitats are also protected. So it has been wonderful to see how the cluster projects has built the capacity to protect the natural environment. And then the other example that is completely different is Pure Grenada. So Pure Grenada, I mean, as you all know, I don't know if Jerry is on the call, but he was the driver behind this Pure Grenada project from the Granada Hotel and Tourism Association. Essentially, Grenada before was recognized around the world, well, I mean, especially in the Caribbean, I would say, as a spice island, you know. And then following the financial crisis, I mean, Grenada hotels and tourism industry was going down. And then the project came where we helped them to establish a brand that is now recognized around the world. I mean, you go anywhere and people now, I mean, I'm Canadian, so obviously when I talk to people about the Caribbean and Grenada, everybody has heard at some point in their life the word Pure Grenada, and you feel that you're going to Grenada, everything is pure when you get there. So this was really as a result of a branding project that we funded for their country, which was also a great success. In St. Lucia, I was like 2 weeks ago, I was at an agro-processing conference organized by, AGROTOURISM conference organized by ICA. And this is another area that I really think we should explore more about I know that across the Caribbean, the hotel and tourism industry has been trying to source their food locally, but it's a huge challenge to coordinate with the local farmers. So it's much easier to import the food. And we have huge import bills in the region, which is not helping our economic development. So therefore, how can we use this cluster initiative, this funding available, to help the Hotel and Tourism Association figure out how to source locally? I was at that conference, and I heard the beautiful story from St. Lucia. I think it was, they actually managed to have developed a mobile app where the Hotel and Tourism, the hotels can actually coordinate the restaurants to help to increase their capacity to source in a more consistent manner from the local farmers. So these type of projects would be absolutely wonderful to replicate. So if you see that type of opportunities, it would be fantastic. But also not that, I mean, there was another gentleman from a chicken factory in Jamaica who was explaining that he's the highest, he produced the chicken from the farmers across the country. He gets he contracts the farmers across the country, get the chicken, process the chicken, and sell the chicken to the hotel and tourism industry. So how can we not duplicate and replicate that type of process rather than importing our food? And then the other example was finally the food and rum festivals. I mean, actually, this is not an example of a project we funded in the past, but I know this would be something that would run super well to have these type of festivals being replicated, especially given that there's huge willingness to pay for food. So, for example, yes, the carnival with music and dance is great, but these type of festivals and carnivals tend to attract Caribbean people. What attracts the foreign visitors and what increases the willingness to pay is do the same type of festival, but festivals, you may have music, but they are willing to pay for food. So offer them food, but not just the fancy restaurants around, but really increase the number of opportunities for them to eat and try different things. For example, in Montreal, we used to have the Just for Laugh Festival, and we used to have the Jazz Festival. Now these festivals were going down at some point of time, or I don't know, they started to innovate. But when you go to these festivals, there's always like half of the whole festival is for food truck, because people go there and they just want to eat. They spend their money on food and drinks. So this is just to drive your thinking, to think innovative products and services that can be created.
Right. Thank you, Annie, for those detailed examples. Well, at this time, this concludes this informational webinar. I'd like to thank you, Annie. And also, what is the best way to reach you or another individual if they have any follow-up questions after the webinar?
Yeah, do I have my email on this slide somewhere? Definitely. Is it possible, Alexis, that you forward this PowerPoint presentation to them so they can, absorb the content, because obviously it's a lot of information.
Yes.
And then they can reach out to me personally, and Courtney, also my colleague. We are both focused on disseminating this call and supporting the design of concept note. We also have a consultant that is available if ever you need to help you think it through. So do reach out to me, and Alexis, I will ask you to send them my emails and my office phone number, my cellular phone number. This is a huge opportunity, so let's just not lose it, and you can reach out to me anytime.
Okay, perfect. Yes, everyone participating will receive this webinar. So I would like to thank everyone for joining today, taking the time out of everyone's busy schedule. And thank you so much, Annie, for all the information today. Greatly appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you for CHTA to organize. I really appreciate, and hopefully we'll remain in touch.
Yes, of course. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.